It's impossible to talk about the golden age of Hollywood without mentioning James Dean. With a film career that went on for 5 years and unfortunately never seeing his 25th birthday, James Dean remains one of the biggest what-ifs in pop culture history. To be the James Dean of anything is pretty simple. A super talented master of their craft that was unfortunately taken from us long before they were ready. There are many of examples that happened with this in the movie industry. I just think James Dean is unfortunately the best example. So because the movie industry example has been established, who do you think is the James Dean of the music industry? What promising young musician who, much like James Dean, showed a talent beyond their years that was unfortunately taken from us before they were ready? If you have followed this channel long enough, you knew this man was coming. Of course, my favorite artist of all time, Buddy Holly. For better or worse, a lot of the current generation knows Buddy Holly thanks to the song from Weezer. I think there's some resemblance between the two, but long before a song was made about him, Buddy Holly was one of the most important and creative musicians of the 1950s. Buddy is often revered as one of the early pioneers of rock and roll. What Buddy was doing at the time to help try and innovate something new was not appreciated by everybody. During the late 1950s, when Buddy was prominent, a lot of the older demographic did not see what he was doing as a good thing, and a lot of them thought it would be a fad. Little did they know the impact that Buddy would have on millions of people, and a lot of them that would actually go on to pursue music in their own way. Amongst the many musicians that were influenced heavily by Buddy Holly, there is no better example than the biggest band of all time, the Beatles. Paul McCartney especially, he is a massive Buddy Holly fan. So much so that Paul owns the catalog to a lot of Buddy Holly's songs and was hosting Buddy Holly's documentary that came out in the mid to late 1980s entitled The Real Buddy Holly Story. Buddy Holly was one of the top acts on the Winter Dance Party tour of 1959. Buddy was fed up with the transportation of this trip. The buses these guys were riding on weren't fit for kids, let alone big-time musicians, along with the horrible weather conditions that came with it. Because he had been fed up, Buddy would charter a plane that would take him from Mason City, Iowa to Fargo, North Dakota. This venue here, the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, serves as the final spot that Buddy Holly was ever able to perform in. Because they wanted clean laundry, food, a good night's sleep, and overall better transportation, the plan was the Mason City Airport in Iowa would take them to Fargo, North Dakota, in which when they landed there, they were merely a mile or two away from Moorhead, Minnesota, which was the site of the next stop. Unfortunately, just mere minutes after Buddy's plane would take off, they would crash into a cornfield in Clear Lake, Iowa, killing all four on board. And it still remains one of the earliest and most tragic moments in music history. Buddy was only 22 years of age. Speaking of Ritchie Valens, he could fall into the same category as Buddy Holly as someone who could be looked at as the James Dean of music. Ritchie's mainstream career that he had wasn't even for one full calendar year, but the impact that he left was profound. One of the forefathers of Chicano rock and a pioneer of rock and roll in its own right, the stuff that Ritchie Valens was doing, especially for somebody as young as him, was nothing short of amazing. If you ever want an example of somebody who was wise beyond their years, there is no better example than Ritchie Valens. Ritchie, much like Buddy Holly, unfortunately saw the same fate as Buddy on the exact same plane with him, which is equally as sad, especially considering Ritchie had a fear of flying stemming from a plane crash that happened at his school 2 years previous that he was not there for. Ritchie was incredibly sick on the night of February 2nd, 1959, and he had no intention on going back to those buses, so he wanted to fly with Buddy to Fargo, North Dakota. Tommy Allsup was originally going to ride with Buddy to Fargo, North Dakota on the Beechcraft Bonanza, but Ritchie kept pestering him all night long about taking his seat on the plane, so much so that Tommy pulled out a $50 from his pocket, flipped it in the air, and told Ritchie Valens to call it. Ritchie would win the coin toss and thus win his spot on the plane, and unfortunately, the rest is history. It cannot be stressed enough the talent level that this kid had at such a young age. He was truly a next level musician. Somebody who knew Buddy and Ritchie quite well and performed around the same time frame that they did was Eddie Cochran. Eddie perfectly encapsulated what a 1950s rock and roller was. Eddie's look and talent was always there, and his guitar playing was prolific, one of the greatest guitar players of his time. He had so much talent that at one point his own label, Liberty Records, envisioned him as the Elvis Presley of Liberty Records. According to Paul McCartney, a big reason he was able to join John Lennon's band the Quarrymen, which would later become the Beatles, was because he knew the chords to one of Eddie Cochran's songs, 20 Flight Rock. Eddie was especially crushed by the day the music died plane crash because he was friends with all three of them. He would go on to make a song entitled 3 Stars that would pay tribute to the fallen musician. Despite all the immense talent that Eddie Cochran had and still being far so young, many have said that he was not quite the same after his three friends were killed, and that somewhere along the way Eddie had convinced himself that he was next to go. He felt like he was going to meet the same fate as his three friends. Unfortunately for Eddie and for music, frankly, his premonition was accurate. It was April of 1960 and Eddie Cochran was in the UK on tour. It was late at night and Eddie Cochran had just finished a show and was on his way to London for his next one the following day, where unfortunately his car that he was riding in would crash and he'd be the only casualty in it. Eddie was not driving this car, he was in the back seat alongside fellow music icon Gene Vincent, the man behind Be-Bop-A-Lula. And in the front passenger seat was Sharon Steele, Eddie Cochran's girlfriend. Once they knew something bad was going to happen and the car was losing control, Eddie Cochran would jump from the back seat to the passenger seat in an attempt to protect Sharon from the impending crash. He would then get launched from the car and would never wake up from his traumatic brain injury. Eddie was only 21 years old at the time of his passing. On Roden Hill in Chippenham, England, you can see the site of the crash of Eddie Cochran that I believe his fans paid for the memorial, so that's very cool. An immensely talented musician, and as proof of his unfortunate passing, an immaculately selfless person. There are tons of examples of somebody who could be the James Dean of music. These three to me just stood out the most. Who do you believe to be the James Dean of music?